Thank you so much, Professor Clausen, for inviting me and for all the aforementioned sponsors for making my visit possible. I have had a lovely time, and I had a particularly lovely time in Professor Clausen's class this afternoon, though I regret to say that my lecture today will not, in fact, be covering bestiality. If you get it, you get it. So, to the material. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's talk about sex. But before we do that, allow me to nuance that slightly. This is a lecture about sex. It is also a lecture about interpretation, and it is a lecture about rabbinic text. So I'm going to speak of the ethics of relationship, and I will speak of the ethics of interpretation. But each category, relationship and interpretation, applies to and is intertwined with each subject, sex and rabbinic text, because there are better and worse ways of relating to a sexual partner, and there are better and worse ways of relating to and interpreting a text. But there are also better and worse ways of interpreting the phenomenon of sex, and there are better and worse ways of relating to a text as a dialogue partner. So all this is to say that this lecture is ultimately about relational ethics. Sex is an intimate and risk-laden mode of relating to other human beings, and hermeneutics, one's approach to interpretation, is an intimate and risk-laden mode of relating to text. In each case, there are better and worse ways of engaging in that relation, ways that are mutual and well-negotiated, and ways that are unilateral and coercive, ways that foster growth, and ways that foster stagnation. In what's to follow, I will suggest ways of relating to the phenomenon of sex that I judge to foster good hermeneutical practice. Or, if you like, conversely, I will suggest hermeneutical practices that I judge to be more likely to foster good ways to relating to the phenomenon of sex, and, I hope, foster good sexual practice in and of itself. What this lecture is not about is halacha, that is, Jewish law. There is a lively and important conversation out there regarding the relationship between law and ethics, and there is important work to be done in the realm of practical halacha and sexuality. But that's not what I'm doing here. Rather, what I aim to do in the time we have together is to begin to think through the moral questions raised by the study of sex and the study of rabbinic text in conversation with one another. What are our duties to those with whom we interact in these ways? How do those interactions shape us as moral and social actors? And what do these particular sorts of interactions teach us about social relationships more generally? So, I will first lay out my central claim about the nature of sex and what that means for constructive sexual ethics. I'm then going to detail what I see as a significant hermeneutical problem in Jewish ethics generally, and that I see as especially apparent in Jewish sexual ethics. I'll offer an alternative methodology that begins to address both claims, and finally, I will offer some brief reflections on the nature of social and textual relationships. So, the central claim and why it matters. To begin, oh, we lost our pomegranate. Can't have that. To begin, I want to make a claim that is the foundation of any other claims I make about sex and sexuality. Sex, I'm arguing, is not a sui generis phenomenon. It's not a special thing off in its own corner. It's a species of social intercourse that is contiguous with and shares phenomenal and moral features with other forms of social intercourse. The ways we behave sexually reflect and affect the ways we behave in other social situations. And the sorts of risks and benefits we encounter in sexual relations are similar to the risks and benefits we encounter in other kinds of social relations. They're not neatly separable from other forms. Business transactions, casual conversations, professional relationships, and friendships can all be sexually charged, while primarily sexual interactions are almost always colored by non-sexual social relationships, interactions, and norms. Now, to be sure, sex has characteristics and carries risks and rewards that are particular to it, But these are not alien to the particular characteristics, risks, and rewards of other forms of social intercourse. Even more important, sex exists with other forms of social interaction within a continuous, dynamic system of desire and control. One does not snap into some other moral framework when one enters a sexual situation. The way one has been conditioned to respond to desire in the presence of others will function in a sexual context as well as in a non-sexual one. Indeed, responses to desire that have been made habitual may apply even more strongly in sexual situations, both because of the instinctual character of desire and because sexuality is often an integral part of the scaffolding upon which broader social conventions are built. And habits that we develop in sexual situations, conversely, can and do carry over to non-sexual social contexts. If we're considerate, confident, and responsive in bed, we're likely to carry those virtues into other social relationships. Conversely, if we're disrespectful, self-absorbed, or even abusive in bed, it's likely those vices will also out elsewhere in our lives. The ways we treat each other in bed, in short, usually reflect the ways we treat each other outside it, even if the specific details of our interactions in bed differ. Now, and this is for all of you who have taken Gender and Sexuality Studies 101 even, to a certain extent, my claim that sexuality is part and parcel of sociality is not a novel one. After all, even the most restrictive of sexual ethicists couch their prescriptions in the language of upholding broader social and communal order. I think, however, that many of these writers are paying lip service to the idea of sex as a social phenomenon, while in fact treating it quite differently than they treat any other form of social interaction. That is to say, their rhetoric of sexuality is not congruent with their treatment of it in practice. There is, for example, no other form of social intercourse that we are exhorted to engage in with only one other person over the course of our lifetime. And with the possible exception of consuming mind-altering substances, I can think of no other major social activity from which entire classes of people are exhorted to abstain indefinitely on account of its attendant risks. And yes, by the way, I say this even during the COVID pandemic. In practice, acting as though the pandemic is over means that entire classes of people are, in fact, excluded from most forms of in-person social activity. But they're not exhorted to abstain from it, assuming that is their existence is even acknowledged in the first place. On which note, thank you for being so lovely about wearing masks to this event. Now, why does it matter that sex be treated as a species of social relationship rather than as a sui generis phenomenon? First, it matters because, simply put, if we wish to regulate sex, we need to have an accurate and detailed account of what it is, how it works, and why we do it. Lofty abstractions about divine union and fruitful mutuality look very nice on the printed page, but have very little to do with the vast majority of people's actual experiences of sex. What we know about people's actual sex lives paints a picture of varied and deeply socially embedded experiences. Second, treating sex as qualitatively separate from other forms of social interaction enables a pernicious silence about sexuality that in turn feeds sexual shame and misinformation. This silence is not just psychologically harmful. It also perpetuates myths that have direct medical consequences. Neglecting sex's social embeddedness also makes us more likely to treat sexual ethics as a matter of individual or virtue or vice, at the expense of its communal dimensions. Finally, and this is the aspect of the problem I'll deal with most comprehensively today, treating sex as a sui generis category encourages a reductionist hermeneutic that flattens out the classical texts from which Jewish ethicists are most likely to draw. And it does this by severely limiting the canon of texts we imagine to have something concrete to say about sexual ethics to those texts that explicitly mention sex or reproduction. But here's the thing. Those texts are rarely the most helpful resources for contemporary sexual ethics. And conversely, the texts that may actually be most helpful for present-day sexual ethics may not have sex as their subject matter at all, or only obliquely. And if we're unable to link sexual interaction to other forms of social interaction, we may miss these more helpful texts entirely. So let's dig into that last problem. Extensive reference to and use of classical rabbinic sources is almost omnipresent in Jewish ethics, especially academic Jewish ethics. Yet too often, these texts are used as though they contain simple one-to-one analogs to the problems with which contemporary ethicists grapple. As the ethicist Louis Newman, who provides perhaps the most extensive internal to the discipline critique of what we might call proof texting of rabbinic sources by contemporary Jewish ethicists, puts it, quote, virtually all exegetes employ a model of textual interpretation which assumes, first, that texts themselves contain some single determinate meaning, and second, that the exegete's role is to extract this meaning from the text and apply it to contemporary problems. But such assumptions, Newman insists, are, quote, questionable if not altogether untenable. Spoiler, he's right. Similarly, within the discipline of rabbinics, scholars such as Elizabeth Shanks-Alexander, Beth Berkowitz, Mira Balberg, and Charlotta von Robert have all argued convincingly that it is problematic to try to straightforwardly deploy the content of rabbinic text in the service of contemporary ethical normative claims. To do so, they note, is to miss a defining characteristic of rabbinic text, that it's primarily about the rabbis and their world. Now, professional Jewish ethics of sexuality tend to have a specific canon of textual sources from which it draws both inspiration and normative force. These texts tend to be either topical and specific, may one do X in Y circumstance, or else they make a metaphysical, theological, or ethical claims in such a way that the reader is readily drawn to apply that claim to a question of sexual conduct. Now, the use of such texts has the virtue of apparent clarity. It seems that for any question a contemporary Jew might have about sexual conduct, there's a text that covers at least the broad genus of act or relation about which the questioner might want to know. But again, the problem with using these texts as source material for straightforward answers to contemporary questions about sexual conduct is that such use presumes that the subject matter of the text actually corresponds to the subject matter of the question in any kind of intelligible way. While contemporary Jewish ethicists may try, for example, to characterize rabbinic discourse as being affirming of sex and sexuality, and I should note that such rhetorical characterization is almost ubiquitous in professional sexual ethics, regardless of any given writer's specific normative claims. That is to say, even the most quote-unquote small c conservative or restrictive present-day Jewish sexual ethics are likely to employ an overall rhetoric of Judaism as a quote-unquote sex-positive or at least sexually rational tradition, usually as a point of comparison to those uptight Christians, essentially. And or if they have a more restrictive mindset in comparison not only to, on the one hand, those uptight Christians, but also to, on the other hand, modern libertines, blah, 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 you know that genus of claim. In this case, Jewish sex, quote, positivity or even sexual rationality and openness are juxtaposed as better, more rational alternatives to either of these, quote, extremes. In any case, while this kind of claim is nearly ubiquitous, a closer look at the texts that specifically engage sexuality reveals that within these texts, discourse on sex actually has more to do with establishing social, familial, and religious boundaries, and crucially, the rabbi's authority to define those boundaries, as well as setting the stage for stories of exemplary, or the opposite, sagely conduct, than it does with sex for its own sake. So the claim that rabbinic text is somehow sexually affirming is not only debatable, it's beside the point, because the text is not primarily about sex or sexuality. Rabbinic text is about rabbinic text. It's also about rabbinic character and rabbinic authority. It's about sex and sexuality mainly inasmuch as those topics provide interesting cases or ways to think through a textual issue or to affirm rabbinic claims of authority. So let me give you an example. And if you'll turn to your source sheets, this is the first source. And I'm going to read first the final paragraph of that and then bring the previous two paragraphs into conversation. Some of you may have heard this one already. Rav Kahana entered and lay beneath the bed of Rav. This is his teacher. He heard him talking and laughing and doing what he required. He said to him, that is, Kahana said to Rav, "The mouth of Abba is like one who's never sipped from the dish." Except imagine like more prurience and like schoolboy wah in the tone there. Rav said to Kahana, "Kahana? Is that you? Get out! This is not how we do things." And I'm frankly impressed that Rav mustered that many words. Kahana said to him, "It is Torah, and I must learn." Now at the outset, just looking at that passage in isolation, one could hardly imagine a more resounding endorsement of the rabbinic valuation of sex. Surely, if a sage compares the study of sexual conduct to the study of Torah, so much so that he feels the need to learn by observing his master in person, sex is of central importance. And, to a certain level, this is true inasmuch as any everyday action is of central importance to rabbinic discussion. But when one looks more closely, this episode starts to sound less like a statement of sex positivity and more like a problem narrative. To begin with, this narrative occurs within a larger sequence that's actually concerned with, at the surface, with proper conduct in the privy. Directly, as you'll notice on your sheet, preceding the Rav Kahana story are two episodes concerning Tanaim, that is, early Mishnaic-era rabbinic sages, and their privy practices. So, it was taught in a baraita, that is an unattributed, or not unattributed, but rather a rabbinic statement that doesn't show up in the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva said, "I once entered the privy after Rabbi Yehoshua, my teacher, and I learned three things from it. I learned that one should not face east and west, but rather north and south. I learned that one should not uncover oneself standing, but rather sitting." We are pro-Zitz Pinkeln here, apparently. "And I learned that one should not wipe oneself with one's right hand, but rather with one's left." Ben Azai, his student, said to him, "You were insolent with your teacher to this point?" He said to him, "It is Torah, and I must learn." It was taught in a baraita. Ben Azai said, "I once entered the privy after Rabbi Akiva, and I learned three things from it. I learned that one should not face east and west, but rather north and south. I learned that one should not uncover oneself standing, but rather sitting. I learned that one should not wipe oneself with one's right hand, but rather with one's left." Rabbi Yehuda, his student, said to him, "You were insolent with your teacher to this point?" He said to him, "It is Torah, and I must learn." And after those two nearly identical passages, then we get the Rav Kahana text that I read first. Now, notice both the similarities and the disjunctions between these two episodes and the story that follows them directly. All feature a student clandestinely following his master into a private place in order to learn a lesson. All assume that matters of private quotidian conduct are important for sagely discipline and learning, and all end with the Hebrew phrase, "It is Torah, and I must learn." So these establish that the three episodes are, literarily speaking, clearly part of the same sequence. But there are notable disjunctions as well. The Akiva and Ben Azai narratives are of a piece, thematically, the privy. Temporally and geographically, they concern Tanaitic-era sages living in the land of Israel, and linguistically, they're in Hebrew. They also constitute a transfer of pedagogical tradition among three generations, Rabbi Yehoshua to Rabbi Akiva to Ben Azai, indicating some kind of success for the lesson. Within these stories themselves, furthermore, the student who follows his teacher recounts the story to another. We don't actually get to see the action itself through the anonymous narrative layers narration. There's also no indication that the student spoke or made his presence known to his teacher in any way. Now, compare this to the Rav Kahana story. Here we see the action as it is occurring from the narrative layer's third-person perspective. The action itself shifts over a century forward and from the land of Israel to Babylonia, and the language shifts from Hebrew to Aramaic. The setting shifts from the privy to the bedroom, and there is no transfer of Kahana's practice to the next generation. After this episode, the narrative shifts back to an extended discussion of proper sagely bathroom practices, suggesting that within the discourse itself, the Kahana story is an unsustainable tangent. The actual events of the Rav Kahana narrative also differ substantially from the previous two episodes. Akiva and Ben Azai are each impressed enough by what they learned from their teachers in the privy to pass the lesson on. Each time, the teacher has successfully modeled sagely behavior for the student. But the Rav Kahana episode is marked by mutual disappointment. Kahana is disappointed and shocked that his teacher's sexual conduct is something other than what he expected, although the phrase he uses, "it is though Ava has never sipped from the dish before," is enigmatic. Perhaps he meant that Rav appears clumsy and unpracticed in bed, or, more likely, that he seems to be too enthusiastic about sex to fit Kahana's idea of sagely decorum, not that Kahana himself is one to speak clearly. Rav, meanwhile, is understandably appalled that not only has his student invaded his bedroom, but that he doesn't even have the self-control to keep quiet while doing so. The genre overall has seemed to shift from pedagogical narrative to farce. The previous two narratives emphasized care, control, and minute discipline, and even the most private and profane of daily activities. But here, even though Kahana sneaks into Rav's bedroom ostensibly in order to learn discipline, he can't maintain it. He blurts out in surprise that his teacher's sexual conduct is far more undisciplined than he had imagined, thereby letting loose, as it were, with his own undisciplined ejaculation. Pause for laughter. That was funny. Acknowledge it. Thank you. The repeated coda that links the three episodes, "It is Torah and I must learn," emphasizes continuity in the first two episodes, but becomes an ironic, mocking echo in the third. And if the disjunctions in tone and setting between the three episodes trouble a reading of the Rav Kahana story as an affirmation of rabbinic sex positivity, some of the conjunctions between the three episodes trouble that reading even further, because common to all of them is the complete discursive absence of women. We know that the Beit Midrash, the house of study, was a male space. Text study was a male activity, and that the formation of the sage was the formation of the ideal rabbinic masculinity. In these three episodes, we see that even spaces that are not the Beit Midrash are brought under the social norms of the space as they are imported into texts that are concerned with sagely formation. Because after all, women, like men, must eliminate. Women, like men, participate, indeed must participate, in partnered sex. The rabbis know this, and elsewhere in the corpus they frequently acknowledge it. Here, however, when elimination and sex are considered as potential sites for rabbinic formation, women cease to be relevant. And in this way, they are treated as similar sorts of phenomena. Elimination is done alone. Normative rabbinic sex requires a partner. Yet even though Rav's wife is there by inference, underscoring, yet again, the disjunction between the Kahana narrative and the two that precede it, the text seems unwilling to actually flesh her presence out, underscoring yet again that this text is less about sex for its own sake, that is, less about a heterosocial partnered activity, than it is about sagely study and discipline, that is, a homosocial activity. As in the Beit Midrash, here too, in Rav's bedroom, that unwittingly becomes a failed microcosm of the house of study, women are discursively absent, even when they're physically present. So this is an example deconstruction of one of what I like to call the hit parade of the rabbis were sex-positive texts. And I've given an example of, okay, if we look a little more deeply into them, they may not actually give us the lessons we want. But where does that leave us? How then ought we to use rabbinic texts to think through contemporary moral problems? In the case of sexual ethics, the first thing to do is to return to my core argument, that sex is a species of social interaction that is contiguous to and shares features with other forms of social interaction. If we approach sex with this understanding, the range of texts from which we might derive guidance expands considerably. The Jewish textual tradition actually offers a wide variety of textual resources for navigating social life, religious practice, and moral development. Even if these other texts are less obviously applicable to direct questions about sexual conduct, on closer examination, they might be able to provide richer, more interesting, and more finely responsive guidance about the appropriate character of relations between sexual agents in a community. And one way to excavate this is to look at the way a particular social phenomenon functions within the textual world. And one example I take from this is from Beth Berkowitz's classic study, Execution and Invention, in Rabbinic Text and Early Christianity, which looks at the way the rabbis imagine rabbinically orchestrated executions would function, if they in fact had the power to carry them out, which they almost certainly did not. And when Beth Berkowitz examines these rabbinic descriptions of the ritual of capital punishment, because ritual it is, she asks in a Foucauldian mode, quote, "What work does this ritual of execution do? How is capital punishment mobilized? What is the political significance of the rabbinic reluctance to execute and concern to preserve the body?" Berkowitz is asking, in other words, about the social function of execution rituals in the world of rabbinic discourse. How do these rituals generate and maintain rabbinic power? What do they reveal about the limits of that power? And more broadly, what do the particulars of these rituals, the specific forms of execution they mandate, the ways they manage time and space, silence and speech, tell us about the workings of a world of complex and multi-layered interactions between person and person, person and state, person and expert authority as the rabbis understood it. Now, Berkowitz asks these questions in the capacity of a text scholar and an historian, but this type of inquiry into the functional details of cases within the rabbinic text can be equally useful for the practical ethicist, such as myself. If we work with rabbinic content, and we accept that the ultimate subject matter of rabbinic text is the rabbis and their world, the next question should be, how do the specific phenomena the rabbis discuss function within that world of rabbinic text? So when one employs rabbinic text to address a contemporary problem, the way that problem functions in its contemporary context might serve as a rubric by which to examine rabbinic text. Texts that seem initially unrelated to the contemporary problem may prove to address questions that are highly germane, because their subject matter may actually function similarly to that of the problem at hand. Thus, sex in rabbinic text has, as a rule, different social functions than does sex in the contemporary world. But there may be other matters discussed in other rabbinic texts that function similarly to aspects of contemporary sexuality. Jeff, how am I doing on time? Okay, so I know we started a little late. So how much longer should I take? Okay, yeah, I'm skipping this section then. So, example. The ways in which Tannaitic texts explore questions of ritual purity provide a relevant and illuminating lens through which to approach questions of contemporary sexual ethics and public health. And within this area, I will focus on the issue of sexually transmitted infections, or STIs. Ritual impurity for the rabbis of the Mishnah, and I should note here, by the way, that I'm deeply indebted to Mira Balberg's account of Mishnaic ritual purity in her book, Purity, Body, and Self. Ritual impurity functions as a form of contagion that is an undesirable but ultimately inevitable consequence of social intercourse. Intercourse which, in turn, is desirable in its own right in spite of its risks. Ritual impurity, furthermore, is not a monolith. Within this class, there exist numerous types and degrees of impurity, each of which has different consequences and different mitigation protocols applied by the rabbis. Throughout, the consequences of transmitting impurity are neither trivialized nor treated as something that is uncommon or shameworthy. The moral implications of ritual impurity thus do not lie in the simple matter of being or not being impure, but rather in the way persons discipline themselves so that they may best mitigate the consequences of being social actors in a world where impurity is an inevitable consequence of social interaction. Now, compare. Sex is a species of social intercourse that is fundamentally important to the flourishing of many to most people, and there's no foolproof method of preventing all STIs. So sexually transmitted infections also represent a form of contagion that is an ultimately unavoidable consequence of certain forms of social interaction that are desirable in their own right, in spite of their risks. Like ritual impurity, STIs are also not monolithic. They vary in type, severity, virulence, and potential routes of transmission. Therefore, rabbinic methods of managing the social risks of impurity may translate quite well into contemporary questions about how sexual agents in public health systems ought to act in the face of STI risk. And I turn now to a text from Mishnah Zavim, a tractate of Mishnah that deals with ritual impurity caused by irregular discharge from the penis, to demonstrate some of the particulars of this argument, because this text that I've chosen elucidates a point about the nature of social contagion itself by discussing how context affects the severity and risk of transmission of a given form of contagion. One vexing issue when it comes to thinking about navigating risk in sexuality, and in changing the conversation about STIs from a clandestine, shame-laden one to an open, evidence-based one, is that we have historically tended to treat, and often continue to treat, STIs as one singular entity. One's either, quote, clean or, quote, infected, and we make little to no distinction among different pathogens, infections, or syndromes. Indeed, historically and currently speaking, one particular STI often becomes metonymic for STIs in general. Early and mid-20th century campaigns against venereal disease, for example, were in fact overwhelmingly campaigns against syphilis, even though gonorrhea was actually much more prevalent. But such a monolithic view is both medically and socially inaccurate. There are many different infections, some viral, some bacterial, some fungal, which occur at different rates in different social contexts. Furthermore, not all infections are created equal. Different infections have different levels of virulence, that is, the likelihood of spread and infection, and different levels of severity, how sick an infection makes one. Take, for example, the stigma surrounding herpes. There are two major strains of herpes virus. HSV1 is primarily associated with oral herpes and HSV2 with genital herpes, although HSV2 can also colonize the oral area. Recent estimates place HSV1 prevalence at or around 65%, and HSV2 prevalence in the US in individuals between ages of 14 and 49 at 15.5%. Worldwide combined prevalence is around 90%, which is to say, you have herpes, probably. This means more people have herpes than not, and outside of certain situations, such as an active outbreak in a laboring person who thereby risks transmitting the infection to the infant, herpes is more of a nuisance than a genuine medical danger. Yet the stigma of herpes is incongruent both with its actual dangers, relatively small, and its prevalence, relatively large. But Mishnaic ritual purity discourse is quite careful to recognize multiple forms of impurity that have multiple levels of virulence and severity, which, where impurity is concerned, I take to mean how intensive a purification ritual is required. And indeed, the first chapter of Zavim is almost entirely devoted to distinguishing between a, quote, true Zav, who's liable for the full purification ritual prescribed in Leviticus 15, and someone with a lesser degree of Ziva impurity. Outside of Ziva-type impurities, the variety is even greater, and the question of varying levels of virulence is explicitly discussed in multiple places. The first chapter of Mishnah Kelim, for example, ranks sources of impurity according to their virulence. A Metzora Someone with an impure skin condition is a strong vector, while someone who has sex with a menstruating woman, a nida, is a weaker vector. People and objects can both be sources of impurity, and whether the initial source is a person or an object also affects its virulence. So ziva, discharge, and disembodied fluids from a zav have fewer possible routes of transmitting impurity than does the zav himself. And there are intermediate levels of impurity at virulence in different stages in the purification process. A metzora is one of the strongest vectors of impurity, ranking only behind a corpse and a bone fragment, but a metzora who has recovered and is waiting out their days of purification is one of the weakest vectors. The Mishnah also understands that ranking virulence is complicated and recognizes a difference between absolute and contextual virulence. While some forms of impurity may have more potential routes of transmission, etc., a less absolutely virulent type of impurity may nevertheless be more likely to be transmitted in a given context than a more absolutely virulent type. So, and I realize I'm very short on time, but I'd like to quickly treat the second text on the sheet. A corpse, according to a different Mishnah, is the most absolutely virulent vector of impurity because it can convey impurity by overhang. That is, anything in the same tent as the corpse will be rendered impure because the corpse and anything else in the tent that share a shadow, which no other source can do. And yet, if we look at the second text on our sheet, we see some circumstances in which a zav may be actually a stronger source of impurity than a corpse. I'm going to skip reading this text out loud, and you can follow along, and I'm simply going to explicate it here quickly. The corpse transmits 7-day impurity and conveys impurity by overhang, which the zav cannot. However, the zav can convey impurity by indirect contact to seats and beds below him, such that they render persons and garments impure, and into anything above him, such that it renders food and drink impure. So the general rule is that the corpse is a more absolutely virulent type of impurity than the zav. But there are circumstances in which the zav has more contextual virulence than the corpse. Different impurities, in short, have different traits, and those particular traits may be more helpful in understanding which source is a greater concern in a given situation than is an abstract ranking. So quickly again, let's now reapply the Mishnah's logic to the case of STIs. As we recall, we have a habit of thinking of STI risk as a single entity, belying the medical and social realities of the matter. Applying the Mishnah's logic regarding social contagion, however, in addition to simply providing a model for the matter-of-fact discussion of social contagion in the first place, also helps us to remember the variety of forms of social contagion that exist. It also helps us to remember that the different subtypes of social contagion have different levels of virulence and severity and require different approaches to treatment and control. And it helps us to remember just how common and unavoidable social contagion is. The Mishnah's reasoning also gives us specific ways to weigh and contextualize risk. It reminds us that, in analyzing the risk of contracting a given form of social contagion, context matters. It reminds us that the contextual virulence of a given source of impurity may not always line up exactly with its ranking on a scale of absolute virulence. And as it happens, context also matters in analyzing the risks different STIs pose. Abstractly speaking, HIV is among the most absolutely severe STIs known. Untreated, it's almost invariably fatal, and it's also easily transmissible through blood and semen. However, contemporary antiretroviral treatment not only turns HIV into a chronic, manageable condition, but it also significantly reduces its virulence. Someone who's been on antiretroviral drugs long enough to bring their viral loads down to undetectable levels is, for most practical intents and purposes, no longer contagious, and responsible uses of barrier methods and PrEP lower the risk of infection even further. By contrast, gonorrhea doesn't have high absolute severity. While it can lead to significant complications if left untreated, it's unlikely to be fatal. Because it's a bacterial STI, however, it is one of the... Thank you, Siri, I didn't need that. By contrast, gonorrhea does, it, also Siri got it wrong, told me about meningitis. By contrast, gonorrhea doesn't have high absolute severity. While it can lead to significant complications if left untreated, it's unlikely to be fatal. But because it's a bacterial STI, it's one of the commonplace conditions whose treatment is increasingly affected by the growing problem of antibiotic resistance. And although most people manage to clear even drug-resistant gonorrhea on their own, reinfection is common. So, in certain contexts, gonorrhea has greater contextual virulence and may have, by certain perspectives, greater contextual severity than HIV. So, to conclude, here is one example of how purity discourse in the Mishnah offers a model of reasoning about social contagion that proves applicable not only to the question of ritual purity, but to multiple concrete forms of social contagion, including sexually transmitted infections. The Mishnah reminds us that social contagion is unavoidable, that it comes in multiple forms and has multiple levels of severity and virulence. It further nuances this account of variation by reminding us that the risk of contracting a given subtype of contagion is contextual. It is not possible, practically speaking, to calibrate risk based on an abstract scale of absolute virulence or severity. In short, the Mishnah reminds us, social contagion is complex. Dealing with it well requires us to reason about it, to talk about it, to make the discussion of its complexities as ubiquitous as the contagion itself. And by forcing us to think about the fine and, yes, sometimes boring details of social contagion, the Mishnah gives us a mode of reasoning about it that makes it much more difficult for us to default to shame, silence, and panic. Thank you.